When a bank abandoned a 1970s agricultural tractor on Ethan's lane, everyone called it junk. The big dealership laughed in his face, telling him he was wasting his time. But they didn't know Ethan. What started as a small, forgotten piece of iron was about to ignite a quiet revenge that changed an entire county forever. The early spring air of April 1995 carried the sharp, familiar scent of damp soil and lingering winter chill across the flat stretches of Fountain County. Ethan was 35 years old, a man whose hands bore the permanent oil stains and calluses of someone who worked 80 acres of Indiana corn and soybeans alone. His land had belonged to his family since the early 1960s, passed down through years of unpredictable grain markets, skyrocketing seed prices, and the quiet, persistent determination required to keep farm ground in family hands. He had stepped out onto his back porch just after dawn with a steaming mug of black coffee, preparing to walk down to his south field and check the ground moisture before planting season truly took hold. But as he reached the wooden gate where his gravel driveway met the county road, something unusual caught his eye. Sitting atop an old weathered oak crate near the mailbox was a small rectangular object reflecting the soft morning light. Ethan walked over, his heavy work boots crunching softly on the gravel. Resting on the weathered wood was a detailed die-cast scale model of a Massey Ferguson tractor, heavy with die-cast metal, complete with a tiny glass-enclosed cab, twin exhaust stacks, and miniature rubber tires that carried the distinct tread pattern of field iron. It was far too intricate to be a simple child's toy. The painted red finish was weathered around the cab edges, covered in a fine layer of road dust. But underneath the grime, the craftsmanship was unmistakable. Tucked neatly underneath the front axle was a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges and damp from the overnight dew. Ethan set his coffee mug on the post and pulled the paper free. It was a formal asset release tag from First Consolidated Bank of Fountain County, stamped with a date from 3 months prior. Beside the corporate ink, a handwritten note from a local implement dealership clerk read simply, "Transport item to Regional Holding. Pending valuation review. Customer delivery canceled." Ethan stood quietly in the cool air, holding the heavy model in his hand. Someone had left it behind, forgotten on a crate at the edge of his property like a piece of discarded scrap. He traced his thumb along the smooth metal hood, feeling the tiny molded rivets and tiny steering gear. To anyone else, it was a piece of forgotten promotional clutter from a bank foreclosure file. But to Ethan, who knew the value of careful work and well-made machinery, it was something that deserved a closer look. Ethan carried the vintage diesel tractor inside and set it on his kitchen table next to his ledger book. The morning sun hit the dusty red paint, highlighting every tiny detail from the tiny three-point hitch to the molded cylinder head. Ethan was a man who believed every piece of equipment, no matter how small, had a purpose and a place. Leaving it sitting on a wooden crate at the edge of his property felt wrong. He pulled the bank tag out from his pocket, smoothed the damp paper across the table, and picked up the wall phone. The first call to First Consolidated Bank of Fountain County went straight to a receptionist who sounded like she was reading from a script. When Ethan explained that he had an asset release tag and a scale model left on his land, she paused, sighed, and transferred him to the loans department. The loans department transferred him to asset recovery. The voice that answered belonged to a young clerk who spoke in rapid, mechanical bursts. Ethan clearly described the rusted vintage diesel engine tractor, the handwritten dealership note, and the bank's stamp on the paper. The clerk typed loudly into a keyboard for a minute before clearing his throat. He told Ethan that the tag was tied to an old agricultural loan file that had been closed out 2 months ago. The promotional display models and dealer gifts associated with the estate had been written off as zero-value clutter. Ethan asked if someone was coming to collect it. The clerk let out a dry laugh over the line. He explained that scheduling a driver or paying postage to retrieve a tiny piece of painted metal was a waste of corporate resources. The transport cost alone exceeded any possible liquidation value. In the eyes of the bank's accounting software, the item did not exist. It was junk. Ethan listened to the quiet hum of the phone line, feeling a strange disconnect. To the man on the phone, the item was just an annoyance in an electronic folder, a line item rounded down to 0. But Ethan looked at the fine metal casting, the rubber tread on the tiny tires, and the care someone had taken to construct it years ago. He told the clerk he wanted official confirmation before he did anything with it. The clerk promised to send a final release letter just to close out the log, then hung up. Ethan set the receiver back on its hook, looking down at the small red machine on his table. By the time the envelope arrived in late July, the spring mud had baked into summer dust across Fountain County. The tiny model tractor had remained on the corner of Ethan's kitchen table for nearly 3 months, sitting quietly alongside his farm journals, parts catalogs, and daily coffee mug. Every morning, as he sat down to log his field hours or organize his crop reports, his eyes would drift to the faded red paint and the tiny layer of road grime settling over its miniature frame. To anyone else passing through the house, it was an odd piece of shelf clutter. To Ethan, it was a small piece of fine engineering that had simply been forgotten. The letter bore the blue ink seal of First Consolidated Bank of Fountain County. Ethan slid a pocket knife through the top of the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of thick bond paper. The language inside was stiff, dry, and cold, filled with formal corporate phrasing. The legal department stated that after an internal review of legacy promotional property, the bank had determined that the administrative cost of recovery far outweighed any assessed value. Therefore, the institution formally relinquished all claims and released full ownership of the item to the occupant of the property address. Ethan read the short paragraph twice. He laid the paper down on the table next to the model tractor and picked up the small machine, turning it over in his hands. Underneath the layer of dust, he noticed that the tiny front steering axle was slightly bent from years of rough handling, and the miniature hydraulic lift levers on the back were seized tight with dry rust. A bank official in a carpeted office miles away had looked at a paper entry and decided it was worth nothing. They saw an insignificant plastic and metal toy not worth the stamp it took to mail a release form. Ethan set the model down, reached into his drawer, and pulled out a clean notebook. He grabbed a pen and began making a small, neat list of the miniature restoration steps required. He would dismantle the small frame, clean out the dried grease in the tiny steering gear, straighten the front axle, and polish the metal back to its factory shine. It was a project that served no commercial purpose, but to Ethan, taking care of neglected iron, no matter how small, was a matter of principle. On a humid Tuesday afternoon in August, Ethan drove 22 miles north to the main regional Massey Ferguson dealership in Lafayette. The building was a massive steel structure surrounded by rows of brand-new, six-figure machines whose towering tires stood taller than a grown man. Ethan walked through the glass doors carrying his worn leather work bag, the weathered vintage Massey Ferguson tractor wrapped carefully in a clean flannel rag inside. The service department was loud and dominated by the smell of diesel fuel, hot hydraulic fluid, and fresh industrial paint. High above the polished concrete floor, giant modern tractors sat resting on heavy hydraulic lifts, their gigantic diesel engines exposed, while mechanics in clean dark blue uniforms worked with pneumatic impact wrenches that echoed off the steel rafters. Massive overhead cranes hummed across tracks near the ceiling, moving heavy cast-iron gearboxes like they were made of wood. The scale of the operation was immense, engineered for high-volume commercial farming where time was measured strictly in thousands of dollars per hour. Ethan walked up to the long parts counter, where 3 countermen sat behind high-end computer monitors, answering phones and typing in part numbers for large commercial farms across 4 counties. He waited patiently as a young clerk finished logging an order for a set of giant dual tires. When the clerk finally looked up, Ethan reached into his bag, unrolled the flannel cloth, and set the small, dusty, rusted vintage diesel engine tractor gently onto the high counter between 2 thick printed service manuals. He explained quietly that he was looking for specialized fine brush touch-up paint, miniature brass rivets, and any old dealer archive manuals that might cover the detailed assembly of that specific promotional release model. The contrast was stark. A farmer in dusty work boots asking about a hand-sized piece of metal, while multi-ton machines roared in the service bays just 50 feet behind him. The clerk stared down at the tiny red tractor, blinked, and then looked back up at Ethan with a blank, uncomprehending expression. But Ethan stayed grounded, holding his ground with calm determination. He didn't care about the size of the iron. He only cared about getting the right materials to restore it properly. The young clerk at the counter let out a sharp, incredulous snort, then turned toward the open bay doors of the repair shop. He whistled loudly, waving his arm to draw the attention of the senior mechanics who were working on a massive, 300-horsepower tractor, suspended on hydraulic lifts. Within moments, 3 seasoned technicians wiped grease from their hands onto shop rags and ambled over to the service desk, curious to see what had stopped the front counter in its tracks. The lead mechanic, a tall man with decades of dealership patches pinned to his jumpsuit, leaned over the counter and squinted down at the tiny, dusty model sitting on Ethan's flannel cloth. A wide grin spread across his face, quickly turning into a booming laugh that echoed off the high corrugated ceiling. The other 2 mechanics joined in. Chuckling shook their heads as they pointed at the tiny bent front axle and rusted miniature hitch. The lead tech slapped his palm against the counter, asking Ethan if he was seriously planning to sink real time and good money into fixing a worthless piece of shelf trash. He gestured toward the bay behind them, where massive diesel engines lay split open, showing off complex crankshafts and $1,000 hydraulic pumps. Out there, he laughed, they were doing real mechanical work for serious farmers, not playing around with tiny metal toys that belonged in a child's sandbox or a scrap bin. They told Ethan he was wasting their time and his own, advising him to throw the metal frame in the garbage and buy a real machine if he wanted to call himself a farmer. Ethan listened in complete silence, his face calm and unreadable, while the chorus of laughter rattled through the glass counter. He didn't argue, nor did he offer a defensive word to men who measured the value of craftsmanship purely by the size of a price tag. He simply leaned forward, carefully picked up the scale model, and folded the soft flannel rag back over its red frame. He slipped the wrapped model securely inside his leather work bag, zipped it tight, and turned toward the exit. As the mocking chuckles faded behind him, Ethan walked out into the bright August sun, knowing with absolute clarity that he would restore every single gear, pin, and coat of paint on that machine himself, right inside his own shed. By November, the harvest was complete, and a quiet, icy frost settled thick over Fountain County. While the bitter winter wind rattled the tin roof of his unheated workshop, Ethan spent his long evenings sitting under the bright glow of a single hanging shop light. The larger farm machinery sat dark and winterized in the shadows behind him, but on his workbench, surrounded by tiny jeweler's screwdrivers, precision tweezers, and a magnifying lamp, the small Massey Ferguson model lay completely disassembled. Ethan approached the tiny restoration with the exact same discipline and precision he brought to his full-size tractors. He did not rush. Working with steady, calloused hands that had spent years wrestling heavy iron, he carefully straightened the microscopic bend in the front steering axle using mini brass pliers. He cleared years of packed dirt and dried factory grease from the tiny internal steering gears, using custom-ordered miniature brass pins and ultra-fine mechanical polish he'd sourced through mail-order hobby catalogs. When a microscopic spring inside the miniature hydraulic lift arm snapped due to age, Ethan didn't improvise a clumsy fix. He spent 3 nights winding a fresh piece of high-tensile spring wire around a tiny steel needle until the tension matched the original factory specification down to the millimeter. To fix the chipped red finish, he carefully sanded the die-cast metal body by hand using fine velvet-grade steel wool, applying thin, meticulous coats of authentic Massey Ferguson red enamel with a single sable hair brush. Night after night, as the temperature inside the shed dropped below freezing, Ethan worked under the warm circle of light. There was a quiet, profound satisfaction in the solitude of the work. The mocking laughter of the dealership mechanics faded entirely from his mind, replaced by the rhythmic click of tiny metal components fitting together perfectly. He wasn't doing this to prove anything to the men in Lafayette. He was doing it because a well-made machine, regardless of its size, deserved respect, care, and absolute restoration. By late February, as the first signs of the winter thaw began to show outside, the final microscopic rivet was seated tightly into place, and the vintage diesel tractor stood complete on his bench, gleaming like new. When spring returned to Indiana in April of 1996, the sun filtered through the high windows of Ethan's farmhouse office, illuminating a piece of work that looked as though it had just rolled off a factory assembly line. The small Massey Ferguson model sat squarely on a polished oak shelf, completely transformed from the dusty, abandoned piece of metal he had found on a wooden crate a year prior. The finish was immaculate, a deep, brilliant coat of original agricultural red that caught the morning light without a single streak or flaw. Every tiny mechanism functioned with absolute precision. The miniature front steering linkage responded smoothly to the gentlest touch of a finger, alignment perfectly squared. The miniature hydraulic lift arms at the rear, once seized solid with rust, moved through their full range of motion with smooth, deliberate tension, holding their position exactly where set. The miniature glass cab windows were crystal clear, set securely within fresh, hand-fitted rubber trims, and the tiny rubber tires had been cleaned, conditioned, and fitted tightly to the restored wheels. Ethan stood by his desk, holding a cup of fresh coffee, and looked at the model for a long moment. It was more than a display piece resting above his farm ledgers. It was proof of what patience, discipline, and uncompromising standards could produce. Where corporate clerks had seen worthless junk and seasoned dealership mechanics had seen a joke, Ethan had recognized underlying quality. He had taken something discarded and given it new life, not through shortcuts or luck, but through dozens of quiet hours spent in an unheated shed with steady hands and clear focus. He didn't need to show it off, nor did he feel the urge to drive back to the big shop in Lafayette to prove a point. The quiet satisfaction, resting on that oak shelf, was entirely his own. Care and precision were not qualities that depended on the size of the iron or the price tag attached to the job. They were habits of mind. As he turned toward his desk to review his spring planting schedules, Ethan knew that the patience he had honed over the long winter months would carry straight into the fields, set to define everything he built from that day forward. Late on a Saturday afternoon in May 1996, Bud Carver drove his dusty pickup up Ethan's driveway. Bud was a quiet, weathered man in his 60s who farmed 300 acres directly to the east, a neighbor who preferred plain talk and judged a man by how he maintained his fences and turned his soil. He had stopped by to drop off an extra roll of baling wire, but as Ethan invited him into the farm office to sign off on a shared boundary fence line, Bud stopped dead in his tracks in front of the oak shelf. The old farmer stepped closer, tilted his head, and squinted at the restored Massey Ferguson model catching the amber evening light. He reached out a thick, calloused finger and touched the rear hitch, testing the smooth, firm tension of the miniature hydraulic lift. Bud looked at the seamless red finish, the hand-fitted cab trims, and the perfectly straightened front axle, then turned slowly toward Ethan with a look of genuine surprise. He asked where on earth Ethan had bought a scale model in such flawless condition. Ethan told him the story plain and simple. How the bank had abandoned it on a crate by his gate, how the big dealership mechanics in Lafayette had laughed at it as junk, and how he'd spent the winter tearing it down piece by piece on his workbench to rebuild every gear and pin by hand. Bud listened without interrupting, his eyes darting back to the tiny machine. He didn't chuckle, and he didn't joke. He just nodded slowly, recognizing the absurd level of patience, eye for detail, and mechanical discipline required to make something that small work so precisely. Bud leaned against the desk, his expression growing serious. He explained that his own full-size tractor, a working 3090, had developed a severe shudder in its hydraulic pump right in the middle of field prep. The dealership in town had told him it would be at least 3 weeks before a mobile mechanic could even come out to inspect it, and every lost day was costing him money. Bud looked Ethan dead in the eye and said that any man who possessed the patience and skill to rebuild a tiny gear set under a magnifying lens was exactly the kind of man he trusted with real machinery. He asked if Ethan would walk down to his shed on Monday morning to take a look. On Monday morning, Ethan walked into Bud Carver's machine shed, carrying his father's vintage steel toolbox. Standing in the center of the bay was Bud's massive 3090 tractor, its heavy steel frame smelling of hot oil, diesel, and dust. The contrast between the hand-sized model on his office shelf and this multi-ton machine was staggering. But as Ethan laid out his wrenches on a clean canvas tarp, the underlying principle remained exactly the same. A mechanical system was simply a collection of parts that needed to be understood, respected, and set right. Ethan started the tractor and listened closely. Rather than rushing to tear things apart, he stood by the rear housing, feeling the vibrations through the frame and watching the hydraulic lines pulse erratically. He identified a high-pitched metallic whine coming from deep within the main pump housing, a clear sign that the internal gear set was slipping and cavitation was destroying the fluid pressure. With systematic, deliberate movements, Ethan unbolted the hydraulic assembly, drained the fluid into clean pans, and extracted the pump unit. He carried the heavy cast iron assembly over to Bud's workbench, wiping down every bolt before setting it in a vise. When he opened the pump housing, his diagnosis was confirmed. The primary gear teeth were heavily scored from wear, but the main housing and drive shaft were completely sound. Rather than telling Bud to buy a brand new $5,000 factory assembly, as a corporate dealership would have done, Ethan called an independent agricultural parts supplier in Indianapolis. He sourced a high-grade rebuilt internal gear set for $280, had it overnighted, and spent Tuesday afternoon installing the new components with meticulous precision. He torqued every bolt strictly to factory manual specifications, replaced the dried seals, and bled the hydraulic lines until the fluid ran crystal clear. By Wednesday morning, Bud climbed into the cab and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and when he engaged the heavy rear implement, the hydraulic arms lifted smoothly, quietly, and without a single shudder. The tractor was completely field-ready. When Bud pulled out his checkbook, Ethan billed him for the exact cost of the parts, plus a fair, modest hourly rate for his labor. It was a fraction of what the Lafayette dealership charged, built not on corporate overhead, but on honest, meticulous work. Bud shook Ethan's hand with a look of deep gratitude, knowing he had found a craftsman he could truly depend on. In rural counties like Fountain, information does not travel through glossy flyers or high-budget radio advertisements. It moves quietly from gate to gate, across fence lines, and over coffee at the local grain elevator. Bud Carver did not keep his experience to himself. Whenever a neighboring farmer complained about the long waiting lists or astronomical labor rates at the large regional dealership in Lafayette, Bud would simply point down the road toward Ethan's farm and tell them about the man who actually took the time to fix what was broken instead of replacing entire assemblies at top dollar. By the spring of 1997, the gravel lane leading up to Ethan's machine shop was rarely empty. What had started as a single neighborly favor for Bud quickly evolved into a steady stream of working farmers seeking honest mechanical work. A farmer named Miller brought in a vintage tractor with a stubborn transmission leak that 2 dealership techs had failed to trace. Ethan spent 4 hours methodically cleaning the housing, identifying a hairline crack in a fluid line that others had overlooked, and brazed it solid for a small fee. Another neighbor brought in a combine with a failing electrical harness right before harvest. Ethan rewired the circuit with military-grade connectors that outlasted the factory setup. Between 1997 and 2001, Ethan's machine shed transformed organically into the most trusted independent repair point in the valley. He did not print business cards or set up a fancy sign by the county road. He simply maintained the same uncompromising standard of workmanship he had applied to the weathered vintage Massey Ferguson tractor on his desk. Every machine that entered his bay received a thorough diagnosis, a clear and transparent estimate, and a repair executed with total precision. Where the big corporate dealership treated local farmers like line items in a quarterly profit report, Ethan treated them as working neighbors whose livelihoods depended on reliable iron. The arrogant mechanics in Lafayette had dismissed Ethan as a toy collector who didn't understand real machinery. But as the years rolled on, dozens of local farmers quietly pulled their business away from the big dealership's high overhead bays and brought their equipment directly to Ethan's farm. There was a profound, quiet satisfaction in knowing that pure skill, fairness, and fundamental honesty were effortlessly outshining corporate arrogance. By the spring of 2003, the volume of machinery waiting along Ethan's gravel drive had grown beyond what one man could manage alone while still tending his own 80 acres. Farmers were leaving equipment near his barn doors, with simple handwritten notes tucked under the windshield wipers, trusting him blindly to fix whatever was wrong. Ethan refused to rush his work or compromise on quality just to clear the yard, but he knew he needed a second pair of skilled hands. The help arrived in the form of Dave Stinson, a 62-year-old veteran mechanic who had spent over 20 years working the main service bays at the big regional dealership in Lafayette. Dave was a legend among local equipment owners, a man who could diagnose an engine knock simply by placing a palm on the valve cover. He had walked away from the dealership months earlier, exhausted by corporate quotas, forced billing structures, and a service manager who demanded fast, temporary fixes over thorough, lasting repairs. When Dave pulled up to Ethan's farm looking for part-time work, Ethan didn't give him an interview. He simply walked him into the shed, where a vintage tractor lay split open for a clutch replacement, and handed him a torque wrench. Within an hour, watching Dave carefully clean every bolt thread before assembly, Ethan knew they shared the exact same uncompromising philosophy. Together, using operating revenue Ethan had saved without taking on a single dollar of bank debt, they poured a concrete extension onto the north end of the barn. They framed out 2 additional service bays, installed overhead chain hoists, and wired a heavy-duty welding station. Dave brought decades of deep factory knowledge, while Ethan brought relentless precision and organizational focus. Working side by side through the long summer afternoons, surrounded by the smell of gear lube, hot steel, and fresh coffee, the 2 men formed a bond built on quiet, mutual respect. There were no corporate managers breathing down their necks, no arbitrary time clocks, and no pressure to push unnecessary parts on struggling farm families. They worked at the speed the machinery demanded, taking pride in doing every job right the first time. For Dave, Ethan's shop was a refuge where honest mechanics still mattered. For Ethan, it was proof that sticking to his principles was building something built to last. When the financial crisis of 2008 hit the agricultural heartland, the credit markets froze almost overnight. Regional banks tightened their lending standards, grain prices swung wildly, and local equipment dealers found themselves sitting on acres of unsold, high-priced machinery that working farmers could no longer afford to finance. The big corporate dealership in Lafayette, which had long relied on pushing multi-$100,000 equipment upgrades every few seasons, suddenly saw its showroom floor turn quiet. Farmers who had once been pressured into trading in their older tractors every 4 years were now forced to hold on to the iron they already owned. While the large dealership scrambled to offset falling sales by raising its labor rates and parts markups, Ethan's machine shop became an indispensable lifeline for the entire county. Ethan had never taken out a business loan or leveraged his farm to build his enterprise, choosing instead to grow organically from what his own hands produced. Because he operated without corporate overhead or bank debt, he kept his repair rates steady and fair, focusing strictly on prolonging the working life of his neighbors' existing fleets. During those lean months, farmers pulled 40-year-old tractors out of dark barns and brought them straight to Ethan and Dave. Where the dealership's glossy sales department saw outdated scrap that belonged in a junkyard, Ethan saw solid, rebuildable American steel. He and Dave spent 16-hour days rebuilding worn transmissions, machining custom bushings, and sourcing affordable overhauled components. They kept family operations running through planting and harvest, without forcing a single neighbor to take on predatory equipment debt just to keep seeds in the ground. By late 2008, as the big dealership in Lafayette laid off half its service crew and cut back its hours, Ethan expanded his parts inventory to keep the most common wear items continuously in stock. His shop was busier than it had ever been, not because he had capitalized on a crisis, but because his foundation had been built on honesty, frugality, and genuine utility from day one. Standing in his bright, noisy bay watching 3 local farms' tractors being prepped for fieldwork, Ethan felt a profound sense of validation. Corporate flash and high-margin promises had crumbled the moment real pressure was applied, but practical skill, grounded integrity, and fair pricing held firm through the storm. On a rainy Thursday afternoon in April 2009, a white pickup truck pulled up outside Ethan's busy shop. The man who stepped out into the drizzle was noticeably older, wearing a faded jacket bearing the corporate logo of the Lafayette dealership. It was the lead mechanic from 14 years ago, the same man who had stood at the front counter in 1995, surrounded by his laughing crew, telling Ethan to throw his little model tractor in the trash bin. He walked into the warm, dry shop, wiping rain from his forehead, and stopped dead. The 3 expanded bays were filled with working machinery, 2 heavy tractors up on lifts, and a combine engine undergoing a precision overhaul. Overhead chain hoists gleamed under bright fluorescent lights, while wall-to-wall steel shelving held immaculate, hand-cataloged inventory covering every rare seal, gear set, and hydraulic fitting produced over the last 40 years. Dave was working at a heavy lathe near the back, turning a custom steel pin with steady focus. The old mechanic stood near the entrance for a long moment, looking around in utter disbelief. He explained awkwardly that the big dealership had discontinued stocking vintage replacement parts months ago to save money. leaving him completely stuck on a longtime client's classic tractor repair. He had been told by 3 different farmers down the road that if anyone in Indiana had the hard-to-find internal gear set he needed, it was Ethan. Ethan walked up to the counter, his face calm, pleasant, and completely devoid of smugness. He didn't drop a single boast, nor did he bring up that humid August afternoon in Lafayette when he had been laughed out of the building. He simply looked at the part number written on the old man's scrap paper, walked over to aisle 4, and retrieved the exact genuine component from a labeled bin. As Ethan rung up the sale and handed over the part, the old mechanic's eyes drifted toward the open office door behind the counter. Sitting squarely on the polished oak shelf, lit by a soft desk lamp, was the pristine red Massey Ferguson scale model. Its finish spotless, its tiny steering linkage aligned, its tiny frame restored down to the microscopic rivet. The old man looked at the model, then looked back at the thriving multi-bay enterprise operating around him. He swallowed hard, nodded with quiet, profound respect, and walked out into the rain without another word. By the spring of 2026, Ethan had spent over 3 decades walking the concrete floors of his shop. He was in his mid-60s now, his hair dusted with silver, his hands bearing the permanent, honorable record of thousands of completed repairs. Dave had long since retired to enjoy his grandchildren, leaving behind a legacy of absolute precision. The shop was running at peak capacity, but Ethan knew that real mechanical skill was a living tradition, something that had to be passed down hand to hand, mind to mind, or risk being lost to an era of plastic throwaway parts. That morning, a 20-year-old apprentice named Lucas arrived for his first day. Fresh out of a technical trade school in Indianapolis, Lucas was eager, energetic, and brimming with textbook theory. He walked into the shop expecting Ethan to hand him an electronic diagnostic scanner or assign him straight to a heavy 300-horsepower diesel engine sitting on the main lift. Instead, Ethan led the young man to a clean wooden workbench in the quietest corner of the shop. Sitting on a velvet cloth in the center of the bench was the restored red Massey Ferguson model tractor, the exact die-cast machine Ethan had picked up off an oak crate 31 years ago. Ethan pulled up 2 wooden stools, sat down, and motioned for Lucas to do the same. Lucas stared at the tiny model, clearly confused as to why a master shop owner was wasting time with what looked like a collector's item on his first morning. But Ethan didn't smile or offer a light joke. He reached into his pocket, laid a miniature set of brass tweezers and a tiny jeweler's screwdriver on the cloth, and told Lucas that before he would ever be allowed to touch a $50,000 farmer's tractor, he needed to learn how a machine actually thinks. Ethan walked him through the microscopic steering linkage, showing him how a fraction of a millimeter alignment error in the tiny front axle affected the drag on the small rubber tires. He showed him how to feel mechanical resistance, how to respect tolerance, and how true craftsmanship begins not with heavy brute force, but with patience, observation, and quiet discipline. Lucas listened intently, his initial impatience melting away into genuine fascination as he realized that the same exact principles governing this tiny metal frame governed every diesel engine on Earth. Legacy wasn't built on loud talk or fast money. It was built on doing small things correctly, step by step, until doing things right became second nature. The golden light of a late spring sunset poured through the high windows of the workshop, casting long, peaceful shadows across the polished concrete floor. Outside, the fields of Fountain County lay open, dark and rich, perfectly prepped for the season's planting. Inside the 3 quiet bays, 4 large tractors stood parked in neat rows, their engines quiet, their hydraulic systems sealed tight, their fuel tanks topped off, completely ready to hit the dirt at first light tomorrow morning. Every machine was a testament to honest work, fair pricing, and decades of steady, uncompromising effort. Ethan walked slowly through the shop, wiping down the heavy steel workbenches with an oiled rag and hanging his wrenches back on their designated wall pegs. He stopped at his main desk in the office, where 2 items sat side by side, framed together under a soft desk lamp. On the left was the original, yellowed release letter from First Consolidated Bank from 1995, a cold piece of paper stating that the asset had 0 value and was not worth retrieving. On the right, sitting proudly on its oak base, was the flawless red scale model tractor, its hand-painted finish reflecting the warm room light just as brightly as it had 30 years ago. Ethan reached out and gently touched the tiny cab roof. What corporate accountants had dismissed as worthless junk, and what arrogant dealership mechanics had laughed at as a toy, had become the quiet foundation of his entire life's work. A bank had abandoned a small piece of metal on a wooden crate and walked away. Ethan had picked up his toolbox, looked beyond the grime, and chosen to see what care, patience, and skill could build. Everything that filled these bays, the trust of his neighbors, the livelihoods preserved, the young apprentice learning the trade, had grown from that simple, quiet choice. He turned off the desk lamp, stepped out into the main bay, and pulled down the heavy overhead door, locking it tight for the night. The tool in his hand was heavy, real, and ready for tomorrow's work. If this story of quiet determination, mechanical pride, and hard-earned dignity resonated with you, please take a quick moment to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates honest work, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep these timeless stories of authentic grit, rural integrity, and American resilience alive. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.